A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. This week, that would be through the end of Shadows of Self. So just make sure you've read the book. You should know that at this point. I mean, come on. Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
Another book down.
Another book down. So, Ben doesn't know this, but PJ was not a reader. We were talking a little bit off air about how I've read a bunch and been reading a lot and whatnot. But part of the goal of this podcast is to get PJ to read more, and so every time it's a celebration of a book down. So we're so glad to have you here today. Today is our wrap-up episode discussing Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson, and we're here with Overly Average Ben.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're psyched. Let it be said that when PJ and I were doing an after episode before, when the recording time didn't work out previously, we just recorded a little thing for fun because we were there. I finally came to realize that Overly Average Ben is a joke for Big Ben, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh my God. I felt like such a moron. PJ's like, oh, I get it. And I was like, what? You get what? And I was like, I get his name. And I was like, what's to get?
It's just the most accurate depiction of who I am as a person. I'm the definition of a jack of all trades, but even worse than that, it's I'm not even competent.
I mean, you're competent. We'll say competent at some things. We'll give you at least a little bit of credit, We can't not. So yeah, we're so happy to have you here, of course, to talk about this book and kind of run through everything. We are going to be talking through this, but tell the people what you're about. Give them a little something.
Well, this is something. It's always difficult because I feel like I just exist. So I make YouTube videos, specifically mostly talking about fantasy, but with being at university and all that kind of thing, it's mostly me exploring other avenues now. I make joke videos sometimes, not so much anymore because it does my self-esteem poorly to kind of sit there and put out a video where I'm I hope people find me funny. So instead I try to just talk rubbish and then hopefully people click on it.
I originally found you because of some funny videos. So, I'm very glad. And I've been watching you over the course of the past year as we've been kind of running this podcast and whatnot. It's been a treat. So I'm super glad to have you on the show and very excited. So awesome. So obviously, we drank on this podcast for the Intoxicating Book Club. So we're going to start off by talking about what we're drinking. So I'll kick it to PJ here so we can give a rundown of what he's having today.
So we're working with time zones today. So I got off work and immediately came home, and you guys were already in the channel talking. So I threw together as quickly as I could, whatever I could. So I made a pineapple rum sour, and it is, give me some leeway here, approximately 2 ounces of rum, 1 ounce of pineapple juice. I used the acid adjusted pineapple juice that I made before. So it is quite sour. I think I'd probably go without that next time. I had half a lime and half a lemon in my fridge, and Kaylin wanted to drink too. So there's a quarter of a lime in here and there's a quarter of a lemon in here, half an ounce of simple syrup. And then that's all shaken and served over ice. So nice, sour, rummy, pineapple-y cocktail.
Nice.
Yeah, it's pretty tasty. Following that up is Dad's Stoked. It's the triple IPA version of Dad Jokes from Blackstack.
Dad's Stoked? Is that what it is?
Dad's Stoked.
No, Dad's Stoked. That's awesome.
Yep.
Well, sweet. Sounds tasty. You'll have to let us know how that IPA is once you crack into it.
Will do.
Awesome. Ben, what are you drinking?
I was saying this beforehand, but I am not much of a drinker. My family is, so whenever I go home, there's a kind of implicit social pressuring to drink. And as a result, I'm all...
Just like this.
Yeah. So as a result, I'm kind of aware of what I like, and that is mostly beer. So I'm drinking Brewdog Punk IPA. It's my standard go-to. In the UK, Wetherspoon serves it, so anywhere you can get it. And it's just better than rubbish. If you're going to sit down and there's the option of you can have Bud or I don't know, just kind of bland beer. And then you've got Punk IPA. You're at least there's going to be a little bit of flavor in this.
Yeah. What's the... I mean, obviously, you've got like a lot of classic beer that originates from Europe in general, and so I'm sure that's a lot of what you find in places. But what's the craft beer scene like in general? Like you're saying, not that you might know, of course, because drinking isn't necessarily your thing, but what's it like, out of curiosity?
We have actually quite a good one in terms of, from my opinion, like where I live. We have a lot of now independent like breweries and independent pubs and that type of thing are mostly going to be craft orientated, like cans and that type of thing, because not only it seems like there's a culture around it that people are willing to pay that bit more for the quality. And I think that makes it, as an independent one, that makes it easier to justify the increase and kind of make it feel like a culture almost here. So I actually really enjoy it. Like when I do drink, I enjoy it. But usually, because my weight fluctuates so much, I'm like, I need to choose between eating or drinking. I can't do both, otherwise I will balloon. And so I choose eating typically. So that's how I work.
I totally get that. Been doing a little bit too much of both myself. PJ, what were you saying?
Oh, no, me too.
Oh, yeah. That's been one of the dangers of doing the show, is realizing need to work out more if we're going to be consistently having 1 to 2 to 3 sometimes beverages per week on an episode.
Yep.
So
and now recording more and more often during the weekdays instead of weekends. So that just makes most days.
I can't cope with it. I find myself so fatigued if I drink. Like I don't know what it is. My body just isn't built for it. And like, I think there was a point when my family had to come to terms with like, when I'm like, I'm going to skip this one. It's because I genuinely need to skip it. Otherwise I'm just going to snooze. Like there's no, it's just kills
someone's carrying me out of the booth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I totally get that. You just got to do like vodka Red Bulls all day. That's the only option. That'll keep you awake. So I am having a little bit of a tiki spin. I haven't done tiki in a while. PJ's been like absolutely... I can't think of a word that isn't just super sexual at the moment. I was thinking railing. I was thinking jerking me around. There were just too much. So we're going to go with something else. That's getting edited out. PJ has been going at me hard. See what I mean? Like I cannot get away from it. PJ's been going after me to like make something with pineapple juice. Every time I ask him, he's like, do you have pineapple juice? You know, when I'm like, what should I make for the show? And so I finally was like, all right, I have to get pineapple juice. I have to remember it. I have to get it. So I made a variation on the shark tooth or shark bite that I'm calling blood in the water. The biggest change with it is that I swapped out the straight simple syrup for a strawberry simple syrup, to kind of give it a strawberry basil simple syrup to give it kind of this more herbaceous note, as opposed, and it goes really well with the pineapple. But to run everyone down, what that ends up being is 1 ounce of Barbados rum, 1 ounce of aged Jamaican rum, half an ounce of lime juice, half an ounce of pineapple juice, and half an ounce of simple syrup, shaken, served over ice, preferably with a straw in a nice little mug. Super tasty.
Do you want to know the secret as far as like why I keep asking if you have pineapple juice?
What's the secret?
I stare at my fridge and see what I have and wonder if you have the same things. That's it. That's the whole secret.
All right.
But how does that basil work in there?
Works out great. It ends up adding like a little bit of an herbaceous note. It adds a little bit of richness to otherwise a cocktail that I feel like is very sweet and rum dependent for a lot of the spices and other things that you get in it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I like it. Tastes good. I'm following that up with a Chalk Hill 2019 Chardonnay. So pretty standard wine, because watching the calories as much as possible inside of this. So calorie in, calorie out, baby. Okay, cool. That's our drinks. So with that, let's get to talking about this book. Ben, I don't know if you've listened to any of our wrap-ups on these, but we've been starting this off with a simple question each time. And it's really easy. It's what allomantic or ferrochemical ability would you take if you could have any, and why? And we'll get into some interesting Era 2 spins on this, but we just need to hear it at this point, because PJ and I have settled, but it's always interesting to hear someone else's take.
Yeah, I like that you call that an easy decision, because I was sat there when you sent it through and I was like, this is going to take some time. And I think the reasoning I came up with is that I would choose tin. And the reason I would choose tin is because I'm imagining that I'm the only one that has it in the world. And I don't like to stand out. I don't want people to be looking and I'm flying through the sky. I just want to exist on my ordinary level, but with just a little bit of an edge over people. I don't want to be able to pull emotions and stuff because that adds some weird free will issues in. I don't want to be super strong because I'm scared that will make me a bad person. So I thought, if I can sit at the back of a lecture hall and not need glasses and I could just improve my eyesight and see, that would be pretty good. And that was my reason. I'll take tin.
All right. And I
That's
feel like
fantastic.
There's a lot of unexplored potential when it comes to tin, even within these books. We had a conversation about sex with tin. I think that'd be pretty great.
I was speaking to my housemate about this, and I said the exact same thing. It was the first thing that came to my head. I was like, "Well, tin's definitely up there. It's starting high."
Glad that you ran it past someone else, because it's like, is this a good idea? And it's like, yeah, it sounds better. Like, of course it does. And
then I also thought, like, even down to the simple things in life. If I've had a bit of meat in the fridge a bit too long, I'm like, oh, is this off? Like, if your smell is that good, you could probably recognize the taint of it easier. And I'm just like, after a couple of years, I'd probably be working on a level unheard of. And I think that would work just on without anyone realizing. They'd be like, how did you know this? And I'm like, I could just hear it. And I'd live being a secret genius.
There you go.
I love that. Just background. You're just like, absolutely no one knows that this is going on, but I eat a little metal of nugget each morning and then I do everything better. Like your own limitless pill, but just for your senses.
Yeah, I'm imagining like I every morning I kind of flick it into a bowl of cereal when I just eat it for my breakfast. Like, I think that's how I'd put it into my routine.
Oh, that's great. As long as you don't go the full savant path, as long as you stick on because I mean, the savant path, while great, would also, I think that could be dangerous, but just burn it when you need it. I can see tin working out great. Mm-hmm. See, we're steel and iron. That's our issue. That's our dilemma. I think pushing's better. PJ believes that he would love to wheel himself around on a little cart by pulling himself everywhere in his house and designing everything that way. He is an engineer.
Well, I suppose it is what falls into your kind of wheelhouse. I suppose if that works for you, you're like, oh, I could make this work extremely well. And I think it's just what naturally you're kind of like, oh, I can, with the skills I already have, this would work 100% well with my life.
Yeah. I mean, my house would be set up almost exactly like Renette's. Like, I would absolutely do exactly that all the time. I think I don't even need a special cart. I just need an office chair. That's it. Maybe. All right. Imagine traveling everywhere by rollerblades and just pulling on cars in front of you.
There is, it's almost like there'd be a sense of being like Spider-Man, like, where he kind of skims along cars and that type of thing. There's a sense of that where I'm like, that just sounds fantastic. You may win me over. I'm tempted. The problem would be spatial awareness. I don't drive because I have a terrible spatial awareness. I'm scared that I'd fling myself either too hard or not hard enough, and suddenly I'm dead.
Yeah.
Never been to the UK, but I think given the pictures of roads that I've seen, I would also be terrified. I don't feel like I have a very bad spatial awareness, but holy shit, almost no room for error all the time.
Yeah, it's I don't know how people do it, because I've been to Canada now and I've realized that I could definitely drive there. I think I could learn to drive fairly easily, but in the UK, there's just there's awareness that not only do I have to be a perfect driver here, but everyone else does. And I'm aware of what people are like in the UK, and it does not fill me with confidence.
Great point. Definitely agree. That is the number one fear of driving for sure, is that, my life is in everyone else's hands and I know how competent everyone else is in medium. I love that. Do you have a ferrochemical choice?
Probably increase and decrease weight. I think that would be a handy one in the sense of like, well, I suppose they'd be separate, but in terms of what's the word? Being able to adjust to situations, I think it would be fairly good to have that in terms of, say, like someone grabs you, you can kind of, or you're trying to get away, you can use that to kind of increase your weight without, I don't know. I don't know. It's not even different from pewter, but for some reason in my head, I feel like there's a difference. And like, as in how it would function in society to other people. But maybe it's just because I feel, I don't know, more inclined to like some of the ferrochemical people that use that power and how they use it compared to how pewter's used. But I don't know.
That's a great point, is that there is something about all the people that we've seen use some of these abilities and the connotation that adds to our understanding, because they've been explored a little bit deeper. And you're right that the idea of lightness in that way is really attractive, because we've seen it used so creatively, over 2 different eras.
Yeah, without a doubt. Like, I think there's also the idea of being able to go both ways makes it extremely different for ferrochemical rather than being able to kind of like only increase. And so I think that kind of makes a difference, because, I don't know, imagine being light. You can just run really fast. Like, you don't have to hold as much. You can, well, not really fast, but you can run faster. You can make yourself so light, the wind just takes you where you want to go, and then make yourself heavier and come back down. Like, there's an infinite possibilities is all I'm thinking about when I come to choose what I do. I'm just like, what could be the most versatile for me?
Does seem to be a theme.
Maybe it's the overly average nature of myself that I'm like, which one can I spread as much as possible?
That makes sense to me, for sure. I think it's fun, rather not fun, but at the very least it makes sense to mention here that you are as far as PJ is right now. Out of curiosity, just because we've been planning this for a while, I think honestly since March, April, something like that. Like, this has been a long time. Did you hold off on reading the next book to like sit in, or was this just kind of happenstance?
It's simultaneously both.
Okay.
Because part of me, I was aware that I was like, it would be nice to read Bands of Mourning and Secret History ready for Lost Metal. But as I've gone along, I was kind of like, there are so many other things that I need to read, and also not to spoil anything per se in what I think, but also have wanted to read more. That I was like, I'm going to hold off so I can come into this at like a kind of, these are my thoughts at the time, and then I can reflect on how I feel after moving forward. So rather than, I think there's a kind of sense of being with PJ that I'm not bringing in future thoughts to affect what I think of this book.
It's great. I mean, I'm sure PJ appreciates it endlessly. I didn't know this until like a week ago. Rather, not even a week ago, a couple of days ago when we were talking about this. And I was like, oh yeah, by the way, Bands of Mourning, be cautious. Like, I haven't read it. And I was like, oh, okay. Sweet.
Yeah, that's great for me. Are you familiar with some of the, like, what's it called? Ars Arcanum?
The cosmere? Is that what you're thinking about? Or the Ars Arcanum,
the extra sort of metal information that's at the back of some of the books that's not technically textually.
I have never read that in my life. I won't lie. Okay. I am the worst. If you put something at the beginning, I will read it. When it's at the end, I'm like, nah, you're all right. I've read your book now. I have put in the work. This is 600 pages long. I'm out. And I did. But I feel like I maybe should. But I'm aware of like the concept that there are things there. But I don't know. Sometimes I'm just kind of like, maybe I'll just leave that and I'll let other people do that for me.
That's fair. Yeah. Sounds good. So we're basically at the same spot.
Yeah. I was going to say, PJ didn't know, and I guess also alternatively, you also didn't know, but Brandon is so, and you've been reading Brandon longer than I have for all imaginations, and we should talk about that in a second. But the Ars Arcanum in Era 2 gives a lot of information up in that Ars Arcanum versus a lot of the other ones are kind of limited. Like, all 16 metals are detailed, and we don't know 2 metals right now. In theory, from the story itself, like, we don't know, but they're in the Ars Arcanum because the character running that knows them, which is just like,
yeah,
wow.
That's interesting.
Yeah, really, it was really strange to me when I read through Era 2 for the first time, and all of a sudden was like, oh, okay, so the mystery of this isn't going to be like more missing metals. You're putting them right there. The mystery is going to be other things and related to other things. So,
which is funny considering the name of the last book.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking of that deep irony in this moment. So I'd love to talk about how we feel about this book on the whole. And Ben, I'd like to also hear in tandem kind of some of your thoughts about Sanderson in general, how you came to him, and then we'll kind of roll that into everything else.
Yeah, if you want me to start, in terms of my feelings on this book in particular, is that I felt it was an improvement on Alloy of Law. Alloy of Law, this actually made me change my rating of Alloy of Law because I realized that I didn't enjoy it as much. I think I was giving it too much leeway, and then Shadows of Self was like, oh no, this is improving a little bit on what I didn't enjoy in Alloy of Law. So I really enjoy the expansion of and the implications of previous characters influencing current events. The Kandra in this, absolutely brilliant. Once the actual plot got started, I was so on board with this book. But the first about 150 pages, I was nervous. I was very nervous because it was mostly just Wax and Wayne, and I was like, I don't particularly like either Wax or Wayne. And I know that like they're two characters that are extremely divisive in terms of what I've experienced, that people either love and like really get their humor or think that they are absolutely cringe. And I tend to find myself drifting towards like, I groan sometimes. And part of me thinks that this would link into how I feel about Sanderson as a whole, is that a lot now I can't read a Brandon Sanderson book without thinking about Brandon Sanderson writing the book. And when I read some of his humor, I'm like, oh my God, what? You wrote this. Like, and I can imagine him writing it.
You thought this was funny.
Yeah, and it makes it feel like even more dad humor because of who he is. And I know that's not a fair critique in the sense of me on the text, but I think that lends itself to how Brandon Sanderson is transforming himself from an author into a personality, and that it's becoming a muddier area in terms of how I view his work now.
That's fair. I think that makes a ton of sense. How'd you come to Sanderson? Like, where'd you start? For instance, this is PJ's first foray. Mine was The Wheel of Time. I've talked about that on the show a little bit. Where'd you come to know or read Sanderson? Mine
was Mistborn Era 1. Who was about 13, and my brother had just bought. He went to Waterstones, which is like the branch in the UK, and he bought all 3. He just saw the artwork, really liked it. He was a teenager at the time as well, so he was just like, I have money for the first time and I'm just going to impulse buy. And so he just bought it with no information, and he read it when he went to university for the first year. And then when he came back, he kind of just pushed it at me and was like, you have to read this. You're going to love it. And that was my first, what would be considered like adult fantasy. I kind of shifted from like Harry Potter and that type of things to Mistborn was my first proper go. And I just loved it. And then I stopped after Mistborn Era 1. I was like, you know what? That was a good run. I'm going to read some other stuff. And then when I was in 2017, I read the first Stormlight Archive book and then didn't read anymore. I was like, I am not reading anymore. And I stopped reading until 2020 when COVID started. And then I came back and read all of Stormlight Archive and then haven't stopped reading since then. But yeah, so it was my brother threatening me that got me into Brandon Sanderson.
It's perfect. That's what big brothers are for, right? Like that's totally as two eldest children of whom threaten the younger ones to do or read things. I totally get that.
Well, there's 9 years difference between me and my brother, so it's not like I could exactly say no.
Yeah, right. It's got that power. That makes sense. That's great, though. I mean, that's a great story. PJ, how'd you feel about the book on the whole? I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but
we have talked about it a little bit. On the whole, I really liked it. I think that this book it's exciting in the ways that it's presenting the same system in new ways. Now bringing in the Kandra and how their interactions with the rest of the society is changing makes for another cool aspect of this story. We got sort of whispers of them through the broadsheets in Alloy of Law, but now seeing them actually out in the open and seeing what they can do and what they have been doing is really, really cool. I love the Kandra. I thought they were really interesting from the start. So overall, it's great, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the story.
Totally. I think I concur. I think that this is one of the interesting things that Ben had originally sent me, because I think you maybe listened to the clip or the episode or whatever, in which I said that like this to me is an 8.5. And that's, I think, high praise. I do have this odd thing where I don't give 7s because I think 7s are silly, because I think that it doesn't really communicate a whole lot about preference on like whether you'd recommend something or not. And so I think that's why I tend to gravitate towards like, okay, I would recommend this. And so it's an 8, or like, yeah, I could recommend as a 6, like if this is your thing, you'll like it. So I try to like cut out 7s, which is why I think like a lot of people, this is a 3.5 for a lot of people. I get that. So here's the follow up to this. So since you land in that 3.5 spot with this book, if you had to choose to go down to a 2.5 or go up to a 4, we can make it a 10 scale just to make it cleaner. But if you had to go up or down, would you recommend it to like universally recommend, or would you give it that little dose? I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I thought about it and I was like, hey, that's so much fun.
I think I would fall on the side that if someone has never, wow, this is so difficult, because I was going to say if someone hasn't read Brandon Sanderson, I would not recommend it on its own footing. I personally see like Era 2 isn't a genre made for me. And so as a result, that's why I fall on the probably the lower side. But part of me is also like, the only reason that I wouldn't recommend this is because I'm aware of how much better his other work is. And so like, I feel that that kind of diminishing returns for me. But as a result, that falls in a weird paradoxical bit where if I'm not recommending it because I don't think it's his best work, but I'm recommending it to someone who hasn't read him, then that reasoning doesn't make sense. So to not answer your question, I'm going to make it both. I'd go both ways. I'd go both ways depending on the person. Because like for someone that has read, someone who's read Brandon Sanderson, I'm like, oh, the only reason that I'm reading this personally is because I know there are further implications. And as a result, I need to be caught up in the full cosmere TM. But
so you're reading it for MCU reasons.
Precisely.
What I'm hearing.
Exactly the case. And that makes it really difficult because, there are certain things that I love about it. And some of the expansion on Era 1 has been fantastic. But there's just certain fundamental things that don't work for me personally, and it makes it a really mixed experience. So I feel like I'm coming at this out of the three of us as probably the most like negative, but I still gave it a positive review. I have fun whilst I'm reading these. It's just not necessarily something I'd have picked up if there wasn't further implications to go through.
I think that's definitely fair. I don't think I would have read Era 2 either if there weren't further implications. I enjoy it on its own now, though. Like, it took a little bit. I'll say that because I've read through Secret History and, like, I've got, 2 extra pieces of context. But
I feel like this is a good point to sort of interject this question, which has been jokingly a point of debate between Crossland and I, but I'm genuinely curious what you think of it. This is considered by Brandon to be the first of the second trilogy, with Alloy of Law being excluded from that. Do you agree with that sentiment, or does this feel like the second installment of a series?
I feel like I would describe this as this is the first, imagine it as like a TV show. This feels like the first episode, and the Alloy of Law was the pilot that was made with a different budget, different actors, but it got picked up, but then they've refurbished it and kind of polished it up ready for this.
I can agree with that entirely. I don't think I agreed with that up until like the last third of the book. Like the last chunk of the book is where that sort of fell into place for me. But yeah, I'm with you on that.
It was something that was heartily debated on our show a couple of times, and to the point of, I think in our last episode, or maybe second to last, that it was even a joke of PJ saying like the 5th book in the Mistborn series, but the 1st book in the 2nd trilogy, but the 2nd book in the 1st era, the 2nd era. It's just like this smorgasbord mess of nonsense that Brandon had set up is thinking about this as a trilogy. And, you know, I think I like the idea of the original book being a pilot. I do think there are great ideas there. And like Miles, for instance, is a wonderful character when he's on screen that, you know, in my opinion, I think Miles is one of Sanderson's best villains in many books. That's the way I'll skirt around spoiling. But I just think that he's really well rounded. And then to move to this book, Bleeder is just an extension of that character that we get. But we don't know that until the end. And then it recontextualizes everything. And that's just, oh, man.
Yeah, I will say that the ending of this book did a lot to really get me back into it because, I honestly, it's one of those ones where like the start. This is going to be weirdly, I'm talking about Alloy of Law, but the start of Alloy of Law.
It's all good, baby.
But do you know, like it's the idea of like when you're writing a character, you don't want to start the book with their stakes having already happened. And Alloy of Law starts with a guy literally murdering his wife. And I'm like, the stakes have immediately dropped off a cliff and we're having to build back up. And it's a hard climb to ever reach that from the start. And so part of me is like, it feels like there should have actually been a book before about that, which is a weird thing to think about. But yeah, I always found that weird. And I always felt like that mess with the pacing for me, where I felt like Wax had nowhere to, he had places to go, but because this is the first installment and we've started so high for his character to then fall and then build back up, that he wasn't a strong enough character, in my opinion, to do that. Whereas in this book, the strength of Bleeder as a character and the whole mystery completely got me through. It reminded me of, like, this felt a lot more like a Sherlock Holmes, where I'm like, Sherlock Holmes is there, but he's just kind of witnessing things, and it's the strength of the rest of the cast to prop up. And I think Bleeder was a great character, and just the Kandra, Tensoon being back, like all these people being back. I was like, it felt like, I don't know if anyone's watched Twin Peaks here, but it felt like watching Twin Peaks: The Return, and you get to see all the familiar faces, and you're like, my heart is melting. The log lady's here. And that's what it felt like to me.
I really love that comparison. A lot of people, so we've even talked about this a little bit off air, but like I wrote a whole book, and PJ knows this, but like part of the reason that book didn't work is because I basically did what Sanderson did in Alloy of Law, killing the wife right away, which fridging and a whole other issue. Professional editor helped me out. We did a lot of stuff, and it's just like that book is always going to be on the shelf forever because it's got some unfixable issues. And yet here this book is, and to that point, you're right. It is so tough to dig a character out of that hole to set up the impetus for everything else. Like, you're starting too low. Yeah, I love that. Love that. That's a core problem in a lot of books, or can be. It can be a bad setup, I should say. PJ, you just spinning there?
I'm just spinning. This doesn't feel to me, and this is just kind of a symptom of my inexperience in stories and in reading. That part of Alloy of Law didn't feel so cliched as Crossland pointed out, but it's my first experience with it, so maybe that's why. I do totally get what you mean by like just dropping the stakes off a cliff right from the beginning, but I feel like with the reveals at the end of Shadows of Self, that sort of is redeemed, but only retroactively, so it's hard to know how to judge that. Because do you judge it chronologically, like with what information had been revealed at the time and within that book even? Or as a whole, can that retroactively change how I feel about the beginning of that book or how anybody feels about that book? So it's a difficult task to try to parse that.
Oh, I was going to say,
I feel like the answer lies. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say,
you fire away.
It is interesting because I know people, like, it's interesting when people sometimes go back. I see often people change their ratings of first books, and they've started as a 3-star, gone through the series and then changed their original to 5-star. And I feel like depending on how the rest goes, that could happen with Era 2. You're like, I feel better about Alley of Law because of the contextualization of later books. But I always feel like that's sometimes a dangerous thing to do, because if you're telling people that first book is a 5-star and people are going in now expecting a 5-star when you thought it was a 3 to start with, you're setting up a false expectation that they're not aware of, that you've come back to it retroactively and thought it was better. And I always feel like it's different in terms of conversation talking about it. I know I'm talking now about specific reviews, but I always feel a little iffy when people do that personally.
It's a tough needle to thread. And I think from an author's perspective too, the idea of consistently going back and you don't want to write yourself in a corner where the next book always has to recontextualize the last book to make it worth it, right? Which is kind of the opposite side of this from the crafter's perspective versus the reviewers, is the book should stand on its own. And the idea that this book does add in a ton of context is great. But you should never, in my head, at the very least, my expectations, I don't feel like it's ever something that you should seek to do, to write something that then goes back and alters so much of a book that it recontextualizes it in a very different way. Because sometimes that can ruin the magic of the original book or book series sometimes. So I think that there's a fine line that you have to dance there between verging in the direction of correcting things or adding context and going too far and breaking things that worked.
Yeah.
You had something there, PJ, but I don't know. I always look at PJ's face because PJ has some tells when he's going to talk, and I saw a tell and I was like, oh, then he went,
I don't
real quick follow-up on that to that degree. Alloy of Law, your re-review, if you had to give it the re-review, do you think that this bolstered it? Like you said earlier, you talked about giving it a different score after reading this book. Was it scored lower, higher? Where'd you land?
Yeah, so I come to it as I don't often change ratings, and the only thing that made me, I'm going to use the magic 7 number here. Shadows of Self to me was a 7. And the reason being is like I said, it fell in that middle of, I enjoyed it whilst I was reading it, but I wouldn't have read it without further implications. And so it fell into that weird little fault line. And that's actually where I put Alloy of Law originally, because I felt the same way. And I was like, Shadows of Self, my feelings finishing that book was so much more than Alloy of Law that I was like, my original feelings, I was right. I wasn't feeling a 3.5 on that. I was feeling a 3. And so I didn't try to go back and think, how has Shadows of Self changed how I felt? It was more like, okay, how was I feeling in that moment compared to how I was feeling now? And I felt better with Shadows of Self than I did with Alloy of Law. And so I rated it 3 stars now rather than 3.5. But once again, it falls in that awkward, this is compared to Brandon Sanderson's other works. And I'm kind of like, if Alloy of Law is a 3.5, like I gave Atlantis a 3, and I think I enjoyed Atlantis just the same as Alloy of Law. And so it's one of those things where I'm trying to put it in perspective compared to all the other books, and it's a mess. The guy needs to stop writing so much.
I think that's something that's so complicated about the way that he's writing the story, in that it's multiple individualized stories that are like connective tissue for other stories, and like he needs this bit of information here in order to make this make sense. And how do I make that stand alone while also being a compelling story? And how does that all get rated together or separately or apart? It's a mess is a perfect example, or a perfect word for how I think you'd have to describe that.
I definitely agree. I think part of the thing for me, at the very least, and I've read more than PJ has, and I think I'm actually the most well-read cosmere person at the table for once. This is crazy. But anyway, I really think that one of the things that's important to do here, in my head at the very least, and how I separate these, is I try to think about each thing as like having its own voice distinctly. And that is interesting because it makes Brandon Sanderson almost an inconsistent writer, but he's consistent inside of each series. So his voice is the same within each series, be it an editor, be it whatever. the voice for Stormlight Archive is very particular. It's very precise. It's a little bit more verbose than anything else. Mistborn Era 1 has a lot of very technical descriptions and some character writings and a lot of like scene setting to get things to places. And Mistborn Era 2 is breakneck speed. And like those different things lead to very different writing styles. And I think similarly, you're welcome. I think this is how we're reacting to it. We should be evaluating, I think, Sanderson as a writer on the whole, thinking about these things. But I think that the way that I try to separate them is like, okay, he's going for something else. He's aiming for something very different here. My enjoyment of that is a little bit separate from what he's aiming for. I think he's nailing what he's aiming for. Do I enjoy it more or less? That's individual, you know?
Yeah, I completely agree with you with that. I think that the further the cosmere goes, the more it's going to be individually what you're looking for is going to affect which one. It already is, like, because like when it comes to, I feel like sometimes, well, I don't think a lot of people will agree with me with this, but it's his writing that genuinely affects my enjoyment of him sometimes. So like, for example, Atlantis, loved the first half. I absolutely adored his work with theology. Anytime Brandon Sanderson writes about religion, I am completely there for it. I think he writes about religions and comments on religions wonderfully.
Mm-hmm.
But then that book decides to be a different book in the last like 30% and it loses me. But that's to do with his first book, etc. But I think that's the case. Right. Is if you're looking more for, you want a book about theology, pick up this. If you want a book that's an epic fantasy, pick up this. He's created a literal MCU model of, depending on how you feel, pick up what you want. And some things may work better for you, some things may not, but there will be a consistent feeling throughout, despite him working in very different ways.
And PJ's read Era 1, Era 2, and Elantris so far. We're starting Warbreaker next month for a short pour, so we're just going to do one episode on it. Personally, Warbreaker, I think, I need to like sit with this for a little bit, but I think Warbreaker is my favorite cosmere entry. Have you read Warbreaker? I don't know.
I have read Warbreaker.
Okay. All right. So this might, I don't want to talk too much about it, of course, because I don't want to taint PJ's opinion, but I totally agree with you. I think that's kind of my core point here, is that I think that for me, Warbreaker is a change where Brandon Sanderson shifted as a writer in a big way. It's right around that Wheel of Time that we talked about offline as well. And it was clear that he wanted to write something that was his, not. So yeah, I think net, I agree with you, because he is MCU-ifying himself. And as such, you know, you might really like the Thor series, but not like the Captain America movies. And so you watch all the Thor movies in theater and you wait for them to go to streaming services for the rest. So I think that totally makes sense. PJ, meanwhile, is still back in fucking...
All I'm saying is bring back Edward Norton.
PJ's watched like literally 5 MCU movies in the last decade, which is crazy.
I watched, actually, I don't want to go on a tangent, but I did watch the last 2 episodes of She-Hulk in isolation. I didn't watch the rest of the series. I just watched those 2 episodes, and it was one of the most baffling experiences I've ever had in my life.
To be fair, that series is a baffling experience in and of itself, and it's intentional? Question mark? Yeah. Shrug? I don't know. If we're giving it a rating on the side of the, you know, can't give a 7, it's a 6, like, or lower maybe. But the high moments are high as hell in those last 2 episodes. The last 8th episode is a high note for the whole series. The 6th episode is also a high note. That last episode, I've got some really strong feelings about.
Oh, yeah? Maybe we'll have to talk about it offline.
Yeah, I think so. God, yeah. I haven't talked about it with anyone yet, so I'm still, it's just like bottled. But that's totally okay. Okay, so PJ hasn't seen much of the MCU. By the way, I think I sent this to you in the DM. Make sure you check out that Intentionally Blank Multiverse of Madness episode on a day that you want to be mad at something. just so you're aware. PJ heard the secondhand. He hadn't watched it, and I just like ranted for 30 minutes.
Every time he thinks about it, he gets mad.
I'm good now. I was not.
See your hands start shaking.
For like 2 months. I was not good for 2 months.
I haven't even watched that film, to be honest.
It's fun. The movie's good.
I do love a bit of Sam Raimi. I think I'm done.
I love Sam. You would love the movie if you love Sam Raimi. That's all you need to know. I think PJ should watch it despite having not seen Doctor Strange 1.
Yeah, you never need to watch the first film in most Marvel films. You just go straight on.
It's a good one, but you can jump in if you want. You know,
I might have seen Doctor Strange 1.
You might have. I might have made you watch it because it was one of my favorite movies in the MCU at the time.
I think I've seen it.
Okay. All right. This has been a great side tangent. We call these, for the record, devil's cuts. We just take it out and we give it to patrons.
Oh, nice. Just
because it's like, whatever, we talked and it's all good shit. So okay, so I got a little bit of assistance from one of our patrons here, of whom also runs a popular meme page on Instagram. So I want to give Ziva credit here for helping me out with a couple of questions. But talking about the title itself, why do you think that Brandon Sanderson settled on the title of Shadows of Self? What layers do you see in that title's significance now that we're done?
I don't know whether I'll go first. I haven't actually thought about this a lot, but there is a sense of
hadn't considered
no
all about the name.
Like I said, I'm someone that just reads the story and I'm done. I don't reflect on any out material. But I mean, there's a kind of this one you get in the sense of recontextualizing Wax, in terms of him not necessarily, he's not the same person he was. And I think that everyone's aware of that, including him. And I also think that almost kind of adds to his character, that he's kind of trying to be something rather than being it anymore. Sometimes I feel like, sometimes I read it and I'm like, so he feels like he's trying to convey a presence and a persona that he does have at certain points, but sometimes it feels like he's putting it on. You've got Wayne's backstory, which would also, I don't know, like the idea that your past never leaves you. That seems to be like, in terms of the foreshadowing for the end of the book, the sense that there are going to be traumatic events that never leave you and are always going to have an implication in the rest of your life.
I like that. I like that answer. I feel like there's also the layer of the Khandra that you could lay into that, with the imitations and the deception that goes along with it. But I don't know if that's as strong of an argument for the name.
No, I'd agree with you there, because there's also the question of like, what do they take away from being that person? And so, yeah, it's kind of like the Khandra are shadows of people. Like, they are that person, but they're just not them. And so, yeah, that actually, I think, is the stronger. I think that is what is actually happening. And I think you're completely right, is that it is the sense of you are like the Khandra are a collection of people they have been, like shadows that are collecting and becoming stronger. It'd be like seeing a weak shadow, and then as they develop, they're creating more of a stronger shadow as they go.
Well, it's disassociative of their original personality, right? So that's the other side of this that I see that adds into that, right? Which is that the more guises that the Khandra seem to take on, some are able to handle it really well, but Lessie took on such a significant guise that it damaged, and she could not get away from that guise ever again. She shifted in that moment, or in those years, from being the servant of the ex-servant of the Lord Ruler and then the servant of Harmony, into Lessie, this woman who genuinely cares and loves Wax, into I'm a dead pawn, and then a rebel, and then I'm going to try like my damnedest to overthrow this thing that really damaged me fundamentally.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Love it. This is also the only, well, not the only title. There have been a couple of others that have been teased, but Sanderson has actually been planting the titles in each book, which is different for him because he doesn't usually, I mean, he kind of did with Era 1. We can separate that out a little bit, but the title for this book was planted in the last book. The title for Bands of Mourning is planted here in this book. And the title for The Lost Metal is planted in this book as well as in the next book. Not that you guys would know about the next book, but there are different moments and beats that hit here. So this was the one that struck me as the most out of left field as I thought about it. But in our reread, I caught that he mentions the shadows of self, and thinking about this idea of dueling personalities was kind of the context from Alloy of Law when he's talking about it. I believe it's Miles that says something to that relation. And of course it's Miles. He's the philosopher of all of the people inside of Mistborn. So yeah, God, it's a good title.
Yeah, it's such a different feeling title than the rest of his work. In terms of, I think,
I agree. Yeah.
I think Bands of Mourning follows in the sense of something that is not literal. And going into Bands of Mourning, I kind of have a preconception of what I think will be the focus in terms of that, based on the choice of words and the relationships. That I think they're more thoughtful titles than a lot of his other ones.
I'm curious now, given that. Where's your thought go with Bands of Mourning and PJ similarly?
I would go in terms of like bands. The first thing I think of is bands as in wedding bands, mourning as in I just think of Wax and why am I blanking her name?
Leslie?
Steris. Their relationship being fueled by his like mourning of Leslie. Now this is also fueled by the idea of people talk about Steris so much. People are like, I love Steris. I'm like, surely Steris gonna have to be a bigger character than what she's done so far, because she's in like 3 scenes so far in this entire
she has 2 POV chapters this book,
I actually really enjoyed Steris in this book, but like part of me is like, there must be more. And so that's what I think in terms of Bands of Mourning. It's him getting over the grief, etc., etc.
Bands of Mourning is mentioned in this book, and I think it's referring to some of Sazed's like metal mines, isn't it?
I don't remember. I'm the worst.
It's not. So no, I forget what the term is for Sazed's metal mines, but it's next to that, and God damn it! Now I have to check the text. Something spoilers. Just give me 1 second. Thankfully, I have the Kindle version of all of these, so I can do it real quick. So Harmony's bands and the Bands of Mourning. So it's separated.
Okay. But they're next to each other. And it's
in that museum in the governor's office, right? So there's the lost metal, which there's nothing there. And it's referring to ATM seemingly in that moment. There's Harmony's bands, and then there's the Bands of Mourning.
Okay.
Interesting.
So we don't exactly know what the Bands of Mourning are. But I love the idea of it being connected to the marriage. I just want to throw that too.
Yeah. And I know we do get several sort of, like this book, multiple interpretations of the story's name. But in the contextual sort of mention of it, it seems like an object of historical significance or a set of objects, which I'm taking because it's next to Harmony's bands to mean some sort of metal mind. But who the fuck knows?
Yeah, I think you can really see that I'm not a literal person. Like, no matter what it is, I think it's why I study English lit. I'm just like, how can I talk absolute shit about something? How can I just make up the stupidest stuff?
And you see that I am a very literal person.
I think that's what's so great is I get to just sit in the middle here and I can feed one and feed the other, and it's great.
So in that respect, I talked a lot about rules. How do you feel about like hard sci-fi and like the definition of rules, and is that important to your storytelling experience?
I'm pretty fine with both. I think once you set up the expectation, you need to keep it consistent. If you are going, I'm putting in hard rules here, you cannot float around with those. You have to be consistent. So like, I read my first Asimov book this month, and I'm kind of like, I read Caves of Steel,
I've not read Caves of Steel.
It's other than there's the short stories, but it's the first robot series book.
Oh, well, then I've read it. Maybe it might be. I think I just read the short stories. I've not read Caves of Steel. Fuck. Yeah. All right. Anyway, sorry. That was my own interest.
And that kind of, it sets up the idea of the literal rules. And so it's playing around those, but the rules are consistent. But then also something like First Law, where it's kind of like free floating magic happens and you're just along for the ride. I'm fine with both, as long as like Mistborn has to be consistent because it's a hard magic system. It's set up that way, and it can't. There are feats that can't be done. There are limitations built in that have to be like almost respected in a way. That's how I feel.
Okay, I think this is really interesting. Have you read? We haven't talked about this at all. Have you read Red Rising? That was our first series that we covered on the show.
No, I have not read it yet.
Highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. The first book is, if we're talking about books, and I can't give it a 7. I'd give it an 8, and the rest of the series is an 8.5 plus. So it's so good. It's one of the best series that I've read. It's what like really got me into reading again in a big way, and doing the show and everything else. So I would highly recommend. But it's one of those that you do have to. The first book is like you'll enjoy it. The second book is a lift that you'll just experience, and your life will be like, oh my god, wait, what? And you'll just have a good time. I have a problem setting expectations, so I'm going to try not to do any more than that. But
to be fair, that seems almost like, I think I'm better at that now, because like in terms of a first book not having to be immediately fantastic, because
right.
I think The Blade itself is something like that, where The Blade itself is a good book, but then Before They Are Hanged is another level where I was completely in love with it. And I think I've kind of come into the phase of like, I can have one book. You can give me one book that's good. Mm-hmm. Then get great. If you're like, if it's a Dresden Files where you're like, read 7 and then you'll really enjoy it. I'm not reading 7 books to get to when it gets good. I'm just not doing it.
Yeah. Right.
So that's something that Crossan and I think we may have talked about off air. I can't remember if we talked about it on or off air, but regarding just hard sci-fi in general and the locked in nature of it, where Brandon Sanderson now is coming to the realization that like, hey, maybe I could have done something more with ATM.
That was online. Yeah.
And that was online. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is getting into the Ars Arcanum a little bit. No, not really. This is getting into Words of Brandon, right?
Yep. Which are bullshit, but it's fine.
They're bullshit. They're not.
It's fine.
Technically true, but he wishes that he could have contextualized ATM as an alloy as opposed to ATM itself, so that there was more of an expansion of possibilities within that metal going forward. And that's something that I'm like, it's difficult for me to wrestle with, because I want this to be a cohesive, like set in stone magic system. But I also understand that the writing has to come from somewhere and has to evolve.
Yeah, that is very true.
And, like, he's getting better at it, and he's like coming into like the understanding of the own system that he's creating as time goes on, and he's pigeonholing himself through what he wrote right away.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, because it's also the sense of like, if you have an idea and you can't do it, that's all you're going to think about as well, which it must be really difficult for him if he's like, I wish I could do something with this. Like, I wish I could have done. And then that would just become a seed that you can't get rid of. But yeah, I suppose I think that's a good point in terms of if overall the story improves because of breaking or changing a rule, as long as it's improving something, then it's worth it, I suppose.
But it can't retcon something that happened. That's the one problem. Yeah.
I think he's stuck. No wonder he has Words for Brandon. It's just him. It's just him venting.
Yeah,
I think so. I think that he's in a difficult place with some of these things because he, like we've said, hard rules I definitely like, right? And inside of science fiction, I think that they're necessary. I've read it. I was talking to Ben a little bit about this off air, but like what I read from 18 to 26 was predominantly hard science fiction. I absorbed a lot of Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Philip K. Dick, Stephen Baxter, Neil Stephenson, William Gibson. I read like just science fiction for like a solid 10 years and then threw in the random King book here and there. And I think going from that into fantasy, what's been very interesting to me is like you play around in a very like muddy water almost, because fantasy, you're building your own rules. And if they aren't concrete to begin with, sometimes when you recontextualize something, it can make something feel very cheap on the other side, because it's like, well, why couldn't Vin have like done that? And so part of what I've been trying to do, at the very least in our coverage of it to begin with, was like when PJ, having no additional context in Era 2 or like savantism or things like that, I was trying to bring up like little details that make it kind of make sense throughout. And man, you do dig yourself into a hole, but I think Sanderson has done a decent enough job making sure that he isn't too far into the hole and can just cut down the edges So it's less of a hole and more of like just an intentional moat. And so he can walk himself in and out of that moat as much and as evenly as he wants. So I don't even know how do we get there. Okay.
I mean, I think at this point,
yeah.
Let's break from theory and break from sort of overarching Sanderson as a whole. I'm going to throw you a softball and a medium ball at the same time. Who's your favorite character of the story as the softball? And as the medium ball, who is your favorite returning character from the previous era?
So is that, because I would say my favorite...
If they're the same, that's fine.
No, I would say that my favorite character
Harmony
was actually Bleeder in this story. I thought that they were extremely compelling, and maybe that's purely because I'm not the biggest Wax or Wayne fan particularly. That I don't know, Bleeder felt like they could have been a Mistborn Era 1 character in terms of their intensity and their approach to the story. It felt like they could have just been lifted straight from it and put here. And maybe that's why I feel more strongly towards them, because that's what I prefer in terms of between the two trilogies. But
so just to go off of that, I would love to see an Ender's Shadow-esque parallel story from Bleeder's perspective of the first.
What a deep cut of your knowledge of literature, PJ. You have like 10 books under your belt and Ender's Shadow. What a great call. Yeah.
I think it'd be really cool to see Era 1 from Bleeder's perspective, to see what else was going on.
Yeah, that actually really would be interesting. And then returning character, I feel like purely for like the interesting nuance to their character, I would go Harmony. I would go Sazed purely because there's such because you know who Sazed is and was, and then some of the actions they're making here, you're like, I need to know what has happened for some of the questionable decisions you're making and your almost callousness. Well, I think it is callousness with human life, like to what extent you've lost who they were, how much they retain. Like, I don't know. There's just it's an interesting development to who was my favorite character from the original trilogy that I have so many questions and so many, I don't know.
Speaking of the callousness, though, I feel like that's something that can be directly compared to the Lord Ruler and his decision making through the first book. The first, that's it. Really.
1,000.
But contextualizing it through the second and third book of Era 1 and understanding where he was coming from for those decisions and how it had to be callous, because he's not looking over individuals. He's looking over like the protection of the world over the course of 1,000 years. And that's all that's on his mind. Whereas Sazed now, understandably, he's competing with another outside god, potentially, that we don't know really anything about. And is it malicious? Is it positive? What's going on there? And there's so much more at play than just the lives of the individuals within a single city or within a single region within this planet. There's so much more that Sazed is going through than what we actually have context for. And I think Callous is a great way to look at it, but only through the lens of our comparably small characters that we're dealing with.
Our pawns on the board, as Bleeder would say. Right. Like, I think that's the important part here. And Ben, you brought up earlier that, like, the Elantris is very interesting because of the ways that it thinks and talks actively about religion. I think this book very subtly focuses on religion, especially given Harmony's context.
Yeah, I hadn't honestly put that together. And that is, like, actually incredibly fantastic, like what in terms of the communication between the two eras, and particularly because by the end of the first trilogy, Lord Ruler is a tragic character, and I do love the idea of that, because I always think that Sanderson's interesting in terms of how he approaches theology, in the sense of he depending on who he's writing from the perspective of course, but like quite often it is like sometimes bad things just have to happen. And I think that's evidently what he's doing with Sazed. That, yeah, I hadn't thought about that, and I really actually appreciate that. It's making me rethink, like, moving forwards. I'm gonna have a different thought when Harmony's involved now.
It's so interesting to think about, and that's why I think, like, that's why I moved originally. I think I was on your side of the opinion to begin with when I rated this book. I think it was originally like, it's right there. It feels pretty good. It was in this reread that I came around and I was like, I think this is one of the most clever Sanderson books because of the way that he underlines and like hits a lot of notes without being on the nose, which I think he has a tendency to do in a lot of his work, is be very direct and on the nose. And that's okay. That's acceptable. But this book has a lot of like soft metaphorical elements to it that I just adore in post. So I'd recommend a reread. I'd be curious to see what you pick up on a reread. Okay, so obviously we've got a lot of lovely characters here to talk about, but I'd love to focus in on the Khandra. We've been talking about the Shadows of Self and the idea they're in and their place in the newfound world. What do you guys, what do you make of Milan and Tensoon's appearances?
What would I go with? Do you know what? I feel like part of me feels like I remember very key elements of this book, but I feel like some of it has drifted in a way. I just remember loving the Khandra, and I've always loved the Khandra, but there's something, the development of their culture, the development of their place in society in terms of our awareness of it is so interesting, and it's one of the complete highlights of the book. And I genuinely feel bad that I don't remember a lot about Milan or Tensoon specifically, so I'm gonna let PJ talk instead and then hopefully remember.
So I still feel weird about Tensoon maintaining the wolfhound body. And I don't know if that's just a holdover fondness of his time with Vin, or if there's something more to it, just falling into comfort in that form. But I would have loved to have seen something more true and something more unique for Tensoon as the guardian of the homeland in the way that he's did. But that's a very minor complaint. It feels weird to me. I don't get why he would keep that form. And maybe that's something that'll get revealed. Maybe it is what it is. I don't know. Milan, I think, is great. And it's making me wish that we got more of her before. We get that she's rebellious, and we get that she's not necessarily conformist. Like she doesn't, she's very non-conformist, but she doesn't sort of conform to the ideals of the Khandra or to people in general. And she presents a lot of that as fact, which clouds the understanding of the Khandra for our characters in this series, but also for any new readers that haven't read the first era. I don't think that's a
great
problem.
point.
I don't think that should be a consideration when writing a character like this. This like, she is who she is, and she's very true to that. But I'm just so excited about the prospects of her interactions with Wayne going forward, because I think it like there's some really cool. I talked about one that's really fucked up, but and won't happen. I know it won't happen, but the fact that Wayne,
your edge case,
my edge case. Okay, I'll bring this up for Ben. Wayne is able to regrow body parts. Milan can consume body parts and replicate them. So over time, Milan could entirely replicate Wayne.
Yeah.
And they could have identical copies of each other running around. And I think that could be really, really cool. But I don't know. Those are sort of my idle thoughts on the Khandra in general. And the returning Khandra specifically.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of mine comes down to like the larger universe at whole, is that like just how the Khandra plays. I just find their relationship with Sazed is just so compelling that it creates a level of confusion for the audience, which I really appreciate in terms, not confusion, but there's a sense of questioning, which I think
occlusion. Yeah, it's occlusion. It's this distant, opaque, mirror-esque kind of a thing.
Yeah, and I think you've answered it in terms of how, like PJ, you've answered it in terms of how he's mirroring Lord Ruler and Says It together, and kind of the parallelism between them. And there's also often, like, in terms of like Sanderson books, the question of like free will and like to what extent do you have control, that this book goes further with than I think a lot of his other ones do. And I think you're right in terms of on a reread, I think I would probably appreciate Era 2 a lot more. At least the first two books. I could love Bands of Mourning completely, but I have a feeling...
We'll see.
At the very least, I think there's more. Maybe if I could just ignore the humor, maybe I would have enjoyed it first, like more on the first read. But I think the Kandra as a whole, they approach the series like they're not in Era 2. Like there's a definite separation between how Wax and Wayne operate and how they're approached as characters in terms of they're played kind of fast and loose, and then there's the undertone of like a past and like not tone. An undertone isn't the right thing, but there's the more that there's a past that has created who they are, but that we're focusing on the present. Whereas the Kandra is almost coming at it as a like there's an intenseness. There's not a lot of humor undercutting it. It feels like they are from a different place in terms of how Sanderson is approaching them. And I think that's why I like the Kandra. The thing is, I'm saying I like the Kandra more, but then I can't remember specifics from the book. It's like I've just completely...
They feel foreign, right? Like they feel very... like they're removed from society, like you're saying, and I totally agree with you there. And it does feel like a very kind of obtuse thing for our characters to be interacting with, especially since no one feels like they've seen the Kandra. And when we learn from Milan that it's like, yeah, we go to bars, we hang out, we like do whatever, and we have, we do what we want to do in the time, and that's just like a great moment of realization, I think, for the whole group. That's like, oh shit, yeah, right, of course. They're just some people that, they're just there, and they exist inside society because of course they do. I think that's nice, but there's also this agelessness and this timelessness that comes from our 2.5 to 3 perspectives, if you include Bleeder Palm inside of the whole thing. They give us some coloration of this idea that they do still feel dated in that older era. They do still have that weight of what came before, which is very interesting to play with. Milan threads that line, I think, going back and forth. And like PJ said, like you've got a lot of knowledge that you have to also balance for potentially a new reader, which again gets into the point of like, is this the entry point for someone in a trilogy of books? Should it be? But I think that's why Milan is presented in the way that she is in moments. So, yeah.
I think specifically with Bleeder, we get some counter to the hard rule idea, specifically because of hemalurgy and what we don't know about it yet, and this metal spike that we don't know what metal it is. So we know that Harmony can take control effectively of a Kandra when they have 2 spikes in them, but we also know that through the entire thing, Bleeder has 2 spikes in her, and the fact that it's a different metal maybe means that Harmony can't interact with it. And like, what does that rule look like? And
that's a great question for the two of you. So I'm just going to like sit back.
Yeah. There's just so much. I think that's something that's a trust instilled through the previous 4 books for me, or 5 books with Elantris, understanding that there are hard rules here. And even though something is seemingly breaking those rules, there's a reason for it. And like, that only works if you buy into the entirety of the series.
Yeah, that's very true. Like there's an element of, you have to have trust in the author that they have enough confidence, but also awareness of their own system that they are willing to divert from it and have readers go, whoa, this doesn't like align, but also have the ability to be like, oh, because he's going to answer it. And there's never a doubt in you. There's never a doubt in you that goes, he's made a mistake. Like, Whereas with some authors, you may have that where you read it and you're like, oh, have they slipped up here? Whereas with Sanderson, you're like, no, that there's never a sense of, you never really question how he's using his own magic system. If you get what I mean, it's very much like if there's a deviation and it's not answered in that book, you never leave it and go, there's a mistake here. You go, oh, this is going to be very interesting when this is resolved. And I think that's kind of the difference where he's playing with a hard system. And so, but he gets the kind of the leeway of a soft system in terms of the reader being along for the ride and not, I don't know, like sometimes people with hard magic systems can get very aggressive when there's any deviation. And sometimes it's just the answers coming. Whereas I feel like with Sanderson, there's an awareness.
He's kind of playing in the sandbox, but he already has some like hard-baked sandcastles, and we can't see them because of like fog of war or something. There's some reason that we can't see them always, and he's done a very good job of occluding that information as much as he can so that we can gradually like walk our way into it. But every once in a while, it pushes that boundary, and I'm like, we're just making shit up. But all writing is just making shit up. So like, okay, what weight do I give you versus someone else? So. Yeah, I totally agree. It's a tough. We've been saying this a couple of times. Era 2 in general had a tough needle to thread, and Sanderson initially didn't even plan Era 2, and I think he does a very good job with kind of doing a lot of this legwork and making it interesting and making it a Western at the same time. I don't know, it's remarkable. But like, is it as good as other things? Sometimes no, sometimes more. Okay. So what about the rest of these fools, right? Like we've been talking a lot about like the sort of meta narrative and some like context on writing on the whole. I want to talk about the characters themselves. Wayne's tragic backstory that happens in chapter 5. See finally giving up on kind of chasing Wax and her growth. I mean, Wax in general. Steris and Wax's relationship. How do we feel about the characters coming out of this novel? We've been talking a lot about like theory, other floaty things around this, but I think we need to hit characters.
I'd immediately jumped in and say that I was a big fan of Wax and Steris in their scenes together. I think it's an approach to a relationship you don't often see, especially in fantasy. Quite often it's the idea of either these people have always got along and they're completely in love, or these people, they never thought they'd love each other, but they come together and it turns out that they're completely melty and in love with each other. Whereas instead, this is like this is more of a partnership in this book where it's like, I know how I'm needed. I know how the other person needs me. And they kind of just, I don't know, it feels almost like an archaic relationship. It feels a very upper aristocratic relationship. It feels like like being British and having the royal family, an arranged marriage that you are making work and that eventually you'll come to just appreciate each other. And I appreciate that. I appreciate an author that's willing to introduce a different type of relationship than we're typically used to seeing. And I personally hated how Wax and Marassi had their whole thing in Alloy of Law. It gave me the absolute... It was the worst because I'm never a big fan.
You didn't want it, but at the same time, it's like there's some like desire there that you don't want to like shut up. But you're like, that's a bad move for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I'm never a fan of age gap stuff. That always makes me uncomfortable because of the implicit power that's involved with him compared to Marassi and everything. So I'm glad that we are putting a nail in the coffin and being like, okay, that's not happening. And I'm glad that the both of them can now progress from that, because that was a real big sticking point in Alloy of Law. I was just like, please stop this, because you're actually writing good chemistry and I don't like it.
For once.
Yeah.
That's something that I think just got worse in this book. I throughout most of Alloy of Law, I didn't mind it. Like, I didn't mind the relationship there, but retrospectively, it just made this story could have been a lot cleaner without having to write around that sort of lost relationship.
That's very true.
It felt like the way it was all kind of written out of the story made me think that Branderson wished that he hadn't done that at all. And it was just kind of retconning without actually removing anything, you know? Like I like the idea of Marasi having googly eyes for Wax throughout the entire thing, but just the sort of way that Wax was able to turn it off and like ignore it and just not respond to it at all going forward. Like all of this story could have worked just as well and had been cleaner had they not had any sort of mutual relationship in the first story.
Yeah. I think there's actually a funny, like, thinking back on it, I do remember there are certain situations where, like, sometimes it'd be in a character's perspective and it'd be like, Wax looked at Marasi. He definitely did not want to have sex with her. And, like, it's not like that explicit, but it's very much like, it's a good thing. Like, Marasi's kind of like, it's a good thing that's not happening anymore. And I feel like it's mentioned a lot, kind of, they're both like, I definitely don't have feelings for this person. And it's like he's telling the audience, like he's poking them and being like, I am so sorry that I even did this. And it's like he feels the need to keep on doing it. He's like, but just that, you know, this really is not happening. And I
should
apologize.
Not have happened.
Yeah.
I love the idea of that being forgiveness, because I do think of, I think about this a lot, because I do think that it is one of the biggest examples outside of the one that I think is the prime example in the Cosmere that I'm not going to talk about, of course, for spoiler reasons. But I think this is the biggest example of pining that any character has. And Marasi pining after Wax. And it was very, not strange. You can understand that it's reciprocal, but it was very grating to like have it be reciprocal at the same time. And then to have him just axe that. And like, it's appropriate, but it didn't actually feel like it resolved in a way that made it feel like it wasn't still a possibility. And I think that's the thing that's the most semi-aggravating about the whole moment, is that it's like, this doesn't feel like it's fully off the table, and it's just like adjacent, and you just want more. You want Wax to be like more into Steris in this, so that it just like distances so much from Marasi that's not even a potential consideration.
Well, I think that's the problem with constantly bringing it up, because you kind of like, yeah, it's been a year for these people. Like, and they're still, every time they see each other, they're like, remember not to be interested. And they're telling the audience, and like,
it's been a year.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm like, it's been a year. Like, surely at this point, it shouldn't be coming up this much. Otherwise, it's odd. And
a foundational thing.
Yeah. Like it's like integral to their platonic relationship, is that it was previously a chance that it could have been romantic. And I think you're right, without enough Steris, and there's such a difference in the relationship between Wax with Steris and Wax with Marasi, that you're kind of like, I don't know. It's hard to, I have an example, but I don't know whether it's too niche. But in terms of, in my head, I'm thinking about it as Sam Vimes with Sybil. If you're thinking about that, where I think they have a similar relationship.
Discworld.
Yeah, Discworld. I think they have a similar relationship, but it would be like if in Discworld, if Sam Vimes was also like, Andrew's looking pretty good. And like they had a semi thing going on, like that would completely undermine everything happening. And it adds a whole weird tangent of, is that what he's looking for? Is he not interested in this more diplomatic relationship? This kind of more understanding, but I don't know, it changes Wax's whole. There is the question of, is this saying that Marasi represents more of a Lessie style person, and that as we go along, it's that he's rejecting, he's getting over that past relationship, that missing of her, and is accepting a different type of relationship with Steris. And as we go along the series, we'll appreciate that more. But it's still, I feel like these are justifications for something that I just never wanted to happen.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Like, in a very simple context, is justifications of something that I don't think ever should have happened, or that I didn't want to happen to begin with. Like, this was never, there were a lot of realities to chase here. This is not one that my brain wanted to like really wander down too far, because it felt, for Wax, I mean, if you even think about his character, he was with Lessie for so long and was in that relationship for so long. And then we see over 2 chapters, like a tragic year and a half of him falling out of that relationship and like the way that he deals with a lot of that grief. Then he goes in and he's finally like maybe open to shit. And he's like, not really though. He goes into this like almost hostage-ish negotiation moment where it's like, this is my family's legacy. I need money to fuel like everything else going on. And man, you wish for better. And then like he mixes, it's not him, but like you mix in Maricy's perspective and just this clashing romance. And you're like, that's not right for you. Get the fuck out. You would never consider that. You would never consider that. You can't consider the fight. Like the financial well-being of your house is worth more than, I mean, at the same time, it's his stepdaughter, so it would have been okay. But like, all of that is also frustrating for half daughter, whatever. It's a mess. It's a mess.
In terms of moving, because I feel like this is like them in particular isn't the most interesting out of all the characters.
Right. Wayne, we haven't talked about Wayne.
Yeah, like Wayne's a character. I feel like I'm growing like to appreciate Wayne more. I found like I really enjoy like when he's changing his outfits, etc., when he's kind of adjusting. I think all of that writing around him changing how he acts, adopts different accents, learns different traits, etc. I am so compelled by that. And then it's undercut by, oh, I've traded this for this, so it's not stealing, and then I'm going to make this weird joke and that type of thing. And those bits don't work for me, where I'm like, there's a really interesting character, and then there's also like part of his character that I don't like, and it's combative. I'm hoping the further we go, hopefully we'll, I don't know, maybe I'll just become more accustomed to it. But sometimes I'm just kind of like, oh, really cool. Oh, he's done a Wayne thing again.
So I have similar reservations for Wayne for very different reasons. I like the consistency of his trading system. A little bit heavy-handed, sure, fine with that. It is what it is. But the part that kind of grates on me is the stark triggers of his like murder trauma. And how present they are and how sudden they are, and but how consuming they are. And that felt ever present in this book compared to Alloy of Law. Alloy of Law, it felt much more subtle. You could tell it was there, but it wasn't like overstated. And here it felt very bold.
Yeah, I do agree with you there, because there's a tonality issue, I think, in terms of some of that, where because it would be kind of like Kelsier, where Kelsier is a funny character, but he's funny in a very different way, but he's also a very somber and damaged character. And Wayne is treated differently because he's like, it would be like if rather than like an Ocean's film, like with Kelsier, where it's like, oh, like he's having kind of banter, it's the team banter, but then he has his own secret past, etc. Wayne would be like if Blazing Saddles suddenly turned into like a hardcore, like 12 Years a Slave. Like it's such a wild, absolute tonal shift that I struggle with between his goofy moments and his really dark moments that, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that like tonal shift issue. Just to say a little bit here, like I understand that tonal shift. I think that that's what humanizes him more to me, is that there is that tonal shift where it's just like his internal monologue is so different than the moments in which you recognizes that he's truly fundamentally done something wrong, and then it just humanizes him to a deep degree, especially in the moment where he goes in drunk to the school, right? And he's just intoxicated and he's like, I am just going to like play through this whole thing. And you're like, ha ha ha, you're having a fun time. And you're like convincing people and you're rolling a natural 20 2 times in a row with 2 people in a D&D RPG campaign. That's how it feels with Wayne in these moments. He shouldn't have made it into that school, but he does because that's who he is. But when he gets to the family that he's wronged, the girl that he's wronged, that's when it all just saps away, and he intentionally does it to himself. He intentionally removes all barriers so that he can feel that pure emotion. And that's where I have a tough time. Like, that's where my breaking point is. I think I agreed with you, Ben, on Wayne's character to begin with. I was like, yeah, he's kind of fun, jokey, but when you like really take in that moment of like him choosing to be sober, him choosing to like take in what he actually did, it deeply makes me think that like maybe Brandon wants characters to feel redemption, and like maybe he should consider that for a lot of different people, and like should think about that as he approaches other people's writings of characters in the future. This Multiverse of Madness episode isn't popping up in the middle of this episode, is it? I'm so sorry. Wow. Weird.
I do.
So
sorry.
No.
I was going to say, I do agree with you, but I just...
It's a tough line to like. It's tough to parse. It's not clean.
It's purely, I think, that I fundamentally don't particularly find the humor funny.
Sure.
That's what I think the difference is, because I 100% appreciated that scene and everything there. I loved. I just don't find them funny, and that honestly, as we go along, it makes more sense because they're both acting. None of them, like neither Wax or Wayne, are who they are. But I think there's a difference because Kelsey is also acting, and I think the problem is that Wayne is done better with Kelsier in the sense of someone who has the ability to have the jokey, quirky little jokes, but also have the very somber internal conflict. And I think it's almost like with Wayne, he's gone, how can I take both of these polar opposites and just take them further? And I'm fine with one of them going further, but when it's the humor that kind of ends up in a place that I'm like, I don't know. It's never worked for me, but I think it's the same as people that like say Era 2 is their favorite. Quite a lot of that comes down to the humor. And I think I just fundamentally miss that, which is just unfortunate for me, really.
I would be very interested, just to speak about that humor bit, I'd be very interested in the ratio of people who appreciate Era 2 and like early 2000s American humor, because that's what it feels like it is. These are early MCU jokes for the most part on like an elevated level and then applied to Westerns. So yeah, I can definitely understand that.
Yeah, part of me thinks
the sort of reservations that I have with Wayne come later, actually. And specifically, the point where he's imitating that mathematician and he gets stopped dead in his tracks when the person accosts him and like accuses him of essentially killing her father. And it's instead of just being a shift in his like demeanor, it is a straight up like stop in his tracks. He's never acted like that way before. Like he's never been thrown off that hard before. And it felt like it was swinging too hard in one direction, and it didn't make sense for what we knew of his character and his relationship with that trauma. Like it felt too heavy-handed in the way that he reacted to it. Like I could see him losing interest in having fun and making jokes, but not just being comatose almost. He feels more put together than that. That's the one point that like really sticks out for me.
It's interesting to both have reservations from the entire opposite end of the spectrum.
We all three do. We have different opinions on Wayne, right?
Feels like if we put us all together, Wayne would be our favorite character.
Right. We could just piece all these different chunks together. We'd all feel the same about Wayne being great. Yeah. It's tough because I think that Wayne is a great character in the way that I think the other most controversial character in the cosmere is not, because it feels like it fits in the world and it feels like he actively is invested in everything that's going on. and the language matches and everything else. So I have a tough time discounting Wayne, because I think that like what Sanderson is going for, he's nailing, but at the same time, the humor is selective. All right. So we talked a lot about like a number of different things inside this novel, of course, but I do want to mention kind of the core idea as it relates to religion here. Where do we stand at the end of this book on Harmony and his use of wax or his status as a god in these moments?
I'm happy to go first, because I have a theory moving forward.
Brain?
No, it's probably the smallest brain take you've ever heard in your life. I feel like because we've got as PJ was saying earlier, this other presence, this other entity that we're not sure about. I feel like we are going to see Wayne and Wax be pushed away from Harmony and end up on a different side as a result of that. I wouldn't be surprised if we have the inversion of like rather than in the original one where Vin is tricked into working for Ruin. I think what we're going to see here is, rather than being tricked by that, we're going to see Wax be pushed away by Harmony and end up with the opposite of that. That's just me. I feel like we have a flawed character that we can do that with and have an interesting discussion around that character and Sazed in terms of pushing them away. I don't know whether that will happen, but that's how I kind of feel. I feel like the questions being set up are, is Sazed justified in this, and has he lost the perspective of the individual person, and is he going to push Wax and Wayne by pushing him too far? I think you could do something interesting with.
So I think I totally agree with you. I think that first of all, just to answer your question, I think Sazed is justified in everything that he's doing. It's just that we're looking at totally different levels.
Yeah.
We're looking at different layers of existence. And they seem like, when you're looking at them simultaneously, that they seem at odds with each other. But I think Sazed is looking more for the entire planet, whereas Wax is looking at for his immediate region. And those don't add up right now. And I think Wax currently has the mechanism in which he can entirely augment his understanding of the universe, and he can also completely fuck our understanding of how this world works, because he has the spike that Bleeder was interacting with, what we assumed to be Trell with. So
fucking Trell
spikes himself with it. He can then communicate with this other god and have additional powers and have hemalurgical powers, and it blows wide open what we can do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to shift from good to bad. It is just a different perspective that we get to explore now. And his feelings and his viewpoint of humanity doesn't have to change, but we get another god's influence. And I'm so excited to see where that might go.
I feel like there are things that I'm bringing into it with not direct implications, but like in terms of realism with different things. That there's a like quite often I feel like Sanderson takes archetypes and has that central archetype in different series. Like different characters will have the same kind of archetype / relationship, and so maybe that's me bringing in a different idea. But I'm glad that we're both on the same page in terms of the I think the central Wax and Harmony relationship is probably the most interesting to me out of the entire series.
And it's certainly strained right now.
Yeah.
And it's hard to believe that he'll just go back to interacting with Harmony as he did without exploring the idea of additional perspectives.
Even as he did is so interesting because, like, as he didn't ever talk to Harmony. Like, he was always speaking in like a general sort of like meditation sense to Harmony in a lot of different moments. And it wasn't until Alloy of Law in like the last year and a half, 2 years of Wax's life that he like really was speaking actively with a god. And so like saying that, it's a fundamental shift in your understanding of the universe when it's like suddenly the god is talking back to you and you're like, I've been talking up to you for so long. I'm like seeking some kind of like thoughts or retribution or like whatever else it is. And now you're talking back to me 2 years after the fact about these important critical details. And I think that for me, at the very least, the way that I think about it, it shifts the religiosity of the moment where it's just like there's Wax, I think in this time feels like his choice in religion is correct, but at the same time has some like grasping problems because all of a sudden it's not as confident or as sure as he'd want it to be, because there's some, pardon the bullshit pun, but there's some like waxing and waning problems that happen within this story in the way that those like relationships and everything else start to happen between characters. It's just a tough thing to grasp, and it's adorable and I love it. God, this is why I like this story so much more. I know that we even talked about this a whole lot, but this is why I like this more than Era 1 on the whole. Is like this ends up being a much more religious kind of breathing experience than I think Era 1 was trying to be, but never really hit in the way that it wanted to be.
I think the other interesting thing is that not only is Wax having God talk back to him, but God's been like, yeah, I'm kind of the one that's been fucking you this entire time. Like, everything bad in your life, I won't lie, it's kind of me.
Kind of me.
Yeah. And Wax is like, what have you been doing? He's like, yeah, you probably wanted me to stay quiet. Like, I'm not going to give you the answers you've been looking for. Sorry.
I didn't tell you, but like, I'm so sorry that I was raw dogging you the whole time.
Yeah. But yeah, I always imagine how different the series would be if Harmony was talking to Wayne. Like, I feel like everything would be a lot more streamlined because I feel like Wayne's he's just a practical person. He's like, someone told me information. So right. I'm just going to deal with that. Whereas Wax is like, he has to question everything. Almost like he's a clever person. I don't like it. Give me Wax, who's just like, he'd be like, okay, you need me to do this? I mean, if you're going to keep nagging me about it, I'll do it.
That's such a good read because it's so like properly dangerous with the whole perspective, which is like Wax is like the Sherlock Holmes, right? And Wayne is some dude who has information. He's like, some dude is like always going to turn it in. He's like, well, why wouldn't I give that to the cops? Like naturally. And like, why wouldn't I do the normal thing a lot of the time? And so I think I tend to agree with you where it's like, the story becomes more interesting because Wax is so questioning of a lot of these things when like Wayne would naturally be like, well, if I have the access to God, I would obviously ask these questions. How fucking dare you be on like your high horse, Wax? Like, come on.
Well,
it's so obvious.
It's like, because I think the reason that there's almost a sense of the reason that Sazed has chosen Wax is because Wax mirrors Sazed a lot in terms of his questioning nature, and that Sazed knew that he had to be the person. Like, in the end, he knows that he has to be the person because he is willing to listen and absorb all different points of view, and the Wax is not the same person, but is willing to actually break something down in the same way. He doesn't take the first answer as the true answer, etc. I think, like I said, Sazed was my personal favorite character from the first era, and I think he remains my favorite character for completely different reasons in this one. Just as a how have you progressed? Like, what's happened? And like, now that you've assumed this absolute control, how is it like the idea of absolute power corrupts absolutely, etc. Like, is he going that way? Like, is he like, because we don't have to necessarily have Harmony be correct. Like, Harmony doesn't have to come away from this actually being in the right. Like, in this situation, God doesn't have to be correct. And then at the same time, I don't know whether I'd like Wax to be like, you're wrong, Sazed, and like do that, because I'm kind of like, all right, calm down. But I don't know. It's
yeah, calm down, boy.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Bands of Mourning has a lot of potential in it right now.
I'm so glad that you guys are both at this point, because it lends me a lot of like authority over the conversation. And I also have to like temper that in different moments, of course, as you were very aware. But God, do I not think that like, cannot wait for you both to read it, because I think it will like just open up a lot of different things, and it'll be a new door into other perspectives. But also, I think that this book poses a lot of these questions that we've been asking repeatedly, which is a lot of recurring things about like, where is Sazed in this moment? Like, what does religion look like as a continuum across ages? That like, the Hero of Ages is so interesting as a namesake, because it means that you are a god across time. Like you're going to, okay, if we think about this in modern context, like you are a Zeus post-Roman. Like you are transcending your regular time framing. You're stretching way beyond that. I think like Sazed as this seemingly omnipotent god, just in these moments when he actually interacts with people, it just makes for some bona fide tasty moments, and it's just so hard for me to talk about, because I need to just shut up and like not spoil things. So I'll pitch it to PJ as to how do you digest and think about the future of the series in this moment, like as it relates to the godliness, these characters. Like, what does this look like to you as we think about the next book, and in theory, in the long sight, the end goal of the series? That's a seriously tough question.
That's a very tough question. Basically, how do I think this will go?
I mean, not how you think this will go, but like, how do you approach like godliness as this series will go? I think that's the thing that I'm trying to hit home, is like, you have our characters, which are one side of the coin, but then you also have the gods aspect, which is Sazed's side. So you've got two dichotomous almost perspectives, because they're not necessarily working on each other's sides, despite their like conflicting thoughts that they're working for each other, potentially.
I hate to use the term mundane, but sure. I think they will become less extraordinary when we start interacting more directly with multiple gods on a personal level. I think it'll become more of a mechanic within the world, as opposed to an outside influence on the mechanics of the world, if that makes sense. And I don't know quite where to go from there, but that's my current feelings on like how I think this will evolve. I think it will just become, we're expanding our scope of the universe to a certain degree. So we're seeing the influences on the mortals of this world. And that will be just as hard of a mechanic as we've come to learn the magic system within this world is.
I agree. I think expansion is the big one for me. Is that I think we've done two seemingly small scale plots, personal plots, and I think we've now teased enough to need expansion to the stakes, because we can't really, we have in a sense culminated Wax's past, like as in the story around it, not fully, but in terms of providing the context in a lot of ways, where now we need to focus on the larger questions that we've been asking, because evidently that's what we want. Like the fact that it keeps on coming back to this, like asking the questions around like his relationship with the two gods, and that's what we're looking forward to, is that needs to be expanded on a lot more, I think, moving forward. But I'm genuinely frightened for the Lost Metal.
Oh, you have a whole book and like a short story novella, they're like, I'm frightened for this finale.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
I think the Lost Metal will be not to put a name on it, but it will be a game changer for everything. I think based on just the implications of just kind of the concept of Trell. Like, I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen there. I don't want PJ to think like I've got some outside knowledge from the different books, etc. I don't. There's just there's a because you know that a larger thing exists. You kind of like, then what the fuck is that? And like, that's kind of what it's like, where I'm like, this is going to answer it. And I feel like it's going to answer it by having like this little pinhole, and then an elephant's just going to run through it. And I'm going to be like, oh, and I'm just going to flinch back as I'm trampled with implications. And yeah, there's a sense of like, I feel like Bands of Mourning, I don't even know what the plot is. I won't lie. But I haven't read the blurb, and I feel like I'm looking past it, which is a big problem. I need to rail myself in, because I know the release is coming. I need to rail myself back in and focus on Bands of Mourning.
Well, good news for you. We're going to be focusing there soon on the show itself. But as such, you can read the book. Thank you so much for like showing up to this with like being like, I'm not going to read it. I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait for those guys. And that's been so cool for us. So, PJ, did you have other thoughts? I don't want to interrupt that idea.
No. I think that covers.
I do just pitch.
I think between the two of us, that covers everything that I'm thinking.
I do just want to pitch the idea of like, what else, ideas or anything else you guys have going into Bands of Mourning? Like, are there any thoughts, predictions, ideas into the next book?
So many, but also none that I can articulate in like a sentence.
Sure.
I also suck at predictions. Mine's just, the one I'll stick with is Wax abandoning. I think he'll abandon Harmony. I think that will happen at some point during the series. Is at one point he will completely abandon, based on the trauma that he has experienced single-handedly because of Harmony's like involvement. I think it's hard to forgive that, like on a cosmic level. From Harmony's perspective, he's like, yeah, it's fine. You know, you had a wife, she died, you know, get over yourself. But from his perspective, it's like, that is an impossible level of trauma to be like, yeah, we're cool now.
We're cool. We're good. Yeah. I agree with that. I think that is like an unforgivable kind of error. And again, I point you towards that Multiverse of Madness episode. That's it. That's all. PJ, where do you stand? What are your thoughts on going into the next book? Come on. What do you got? Arm me up.
I mean, my biggest thing is I expect it to be less of a minute view on Scadrial, and I expect there to be an expanded view of the gods' influence on the planet as a whole. We'll get Wax's perspective on this region of the world, but I expect us to get more of a complete view from the gods that we know are influencing it, and the parts of the planet that we know are not represented so far in this series.
All right. Ben, anything else to add? Any questions for us? Do you have any fucking questions for us? Pieces of shit? Do you have any idea?
I am absolutely blank.
All right.
Like I said, I'm terrible at predictions. I will. Quite often I'll get predictions right, but that's because I have made 100 different predictions and I have stumbled onto the correct one, and then I can be like, man, I totally called that, but I called it for one page and then had 100 different guesses along the way.
Oh man, that's so interesting. It's so tough because like PJ, I hold accountable to every guess that he makes for the most part. So like everything is like this. I
contradict myself fucking constantly, and he still holds me accountable.
It's very interesting. As I only hold them accountable to the first guess, and then as things come true, usually. but as it goes. Ben, so gracious of you to show up on our show. We're so thankful. I hope you had a good time. We had a great time having you on the show. It's been killer.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I know, like I mentioned at the top of the show, we're dealing with time zones right now. What time is it for you at the moment?
It is 1 a.m.
Yeah, I was about to say.
I am so sorry.
You're about to hit that. So we're closing out on that ceiling. Next week, we're reading Bands of Mourning, Prologue through Chapter 4. Again, Prologue through Chapter 4. You know, we see that on our website at wordsandwhiskey.show/schedule. Is it calendar? Which one is it? I don't know. It's one of the two. Something. You can check it out. Click the button. You'll find it. Yeah. So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, as always, to Tim and Andrew for keeping the show's lights on. But thank you to Ben for coming and making this show what it is today.
Thank you very much.
It's been a lot of fun.
Ben, where can people find you?
Mainly, well, it's just YouTube. I'm overly average Ben.
You're not just on YouTube.
No, I wander around. I'm on Insta. I'm everywhere where everyone else is, screaming into the void, just like everyone else.
So say we all.
Yeah. But mainly if you hit up my YouTube, you'll well, I mean, to be fair, you've got an idea of who I am based on this. So I'd like to apologize on the whole, and the regular scheduled entertainment will resume next week without me.
Oh no. I'm so sorry. You don't need to apologize. We're having a great time. I hope you had a good time on the show. Regardless, you can find us at Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit. And you can email us at wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com. You can check us out on patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey. T-shirts on TeePublic, of course, for the time being. Check out the link in the show notes. Beyond that, we're so glad, again, Ben, to have you on the show. I'm so overjoyed in the way the show went. Cheers.
Mine's empty, but I'll cheers.
So is mine.
Yeah, fuck us. It's fine. Thank you, and we'll see you on the other side.